May 1945. The guns are silent, yet Europe is far from peace. More than 40 million displaced people, civilians driven from their homes, freed prisoners of war, survivors of concentration camps, forced laborers, and minorities expelled from new borders, struggle to find their place in the ruins. The Reich has collapsed, but trains still groan under the weight of uprooted families, carrying them toward homes that often no longer exist. The fighting may be over, but logistics have only changed form. Rail lines, food stocks, and governing systems now serve not armies but survival. The central question remains: how do you rebuild nations with no housing, no supplies, and shattered institutions? In this video, we'll follow the moving parts: mass displacement, the clearing of rubble, shortages of shelter, fragile economies, and the rival visions that hardened into the Cold War. This story begins with a continent still on the move. A continent of refugees. Europe in 1945 was a continent reshaped by human flight. Millions of families, soldiers, and survivors crowded together on damaged roads and crippled rail lines, moving with no clear direction while borders shifted around them. It was a scene of confusion on a scale the world had never seen, as nations struggled to comprehend how many people had been uprooted, where they had come from, and where they could possibly go next. By 1945, more than 40 million lives were caught in this drift, a broad count that included displaced civilians, freed prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, forced laborers, and uprooted minorities. Some estimates count roughly 11 million officially registered displaced persons under Allied control, with about 8 million concentrated in Germany, but vast numbers of others moved outside this framework. The war had displaced so many that even governments accustomed to wartime disruption had no precedent for managing it. The collapse of civil administration left entire populations effectively unrecorded. For Jewish survivors of camps and hiding places, return often meant leaving Europe entirely. Many gathered in displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria, waiting not for resettlement in their pro-war homes, but for ships carrying them to Palestine or across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, German-speaking communities that had lived for generations in Eastern Europe were forced westward. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. These expulsions, sanctioned by the Potsdam Agreement but carried out with brutal haste, caused widespread suffering. Historians estimate up to 2 million died or vanished along the route, deaths from disease, malnutrition, exposure, and violence. Not all forced migrations were sudden expulsions. Poles, too, were displaced on a massive scale. New Soviet borders cut away their eastern lands, and families who had lived in towns now ceded to Ukraine, Belarus, or Lithuania were pushed westward into the emptied German territories around Wrocław and Gdansk. In the Balkans, similar shifts transferred whole villages from one population to another in the space of months. Each wave brought another layer of disruption, displacing earlier arrivals or sending returning residents back out onto the road. Even within Germany, the scale of dislocation defied comprehension. Families evacuated during the bombing campaigns returned to cities that no longer stood. Freed Soviet prisoners of war were gathered into holding centers, waiting for trains eastward. Concentration camp survivors were concentrated in separate displaced persons camps, where international relief workers tried to provide food and shelter while survivors petitioned for permanent resettlement. For some, emigration came within months. For others, the waiting stretched for years inside camp barracks that blurred the boundary between confinement and sanctuary. Transport was a constant obstacle. Bombed-out rail lines and fuel shortages made even short journeys unpredictable. Families crowded into station platforms that had become holding pens, waiting days on end for a promised train that could finally carry them onward. On the roads, carts piled with the last pieces of furniture moved more slowly than military trucks maneuvering through ruined landscapes. The chaos of columns, on trains, on roads, and on foot, expressed not just the desperation of individual travelers, but also the collapse of administrative order. Relief agencies tried to impose some structure. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRRA, oversaw many of the displaced persons camps, categorizing their inhabitants by nationality and trying to arrange repatriation. SHAEF, the Allied Military Command, organized transport in its occupied territories, while the Soviet administration launched a vast repatriation program. Pamphlets and films urged displaced Soviet citizens to return east, though many resisted, fearing what awaited them at home. Even with such efforts, the flow of people constantly exceeded what officials could track, and welfare systems were overwhelmed. For civilians in towns and villages, the sheer presence of outsiders changed daily life. In northern Italy, survivors drifted southward toward ports, hoping for ships to Palestine or beyond. Along the Danube, populations in riverside townships shifted several times in a single season. German families marched out, locals reclaimed houses, and then fresh groups arrived from further east. The sound of unfamiliar languages echoed in streets that only months earlier had held one community. Residents found their neighborhoods altered almost overnight, remade by strangers with no choice in where they had landed. The humanitarian challenge was immense, but it overlapped with politics. Jewish survivors pressing for emigration forced Britain, still holding the mandate in Palestine, into difficult decisions. Millions of Germans pushed westward, raised debates among Allied leaders over whether collective expulsions could ever be justified. At the same time, Eastern governments, encouraged by Moscow, saw population transfers as a way to construct ethnically uniform states, rooting out old minorities once regarded as sources of political instability. In practice, the demographic map of Europe was being rewritten not only in conference rooms, but also on the march. Conditions in camps varied, but overcrowding was common, and shortages of food, medicine, and fuel posed constant threats. Epidemics emerged in camps outside ruined cities. Families without documents slipped past checkpoints, spreading further confusion. In some regions, the numbers of newcomers exceeded the number of surviving locals. Towns that had once had clear identities were suddenly home to a patchwork of languages, customs, and politics. By 1947, some of the currents slowed as governments began formalizing resettlement and emigration programs. Families were assigned housing, new borders were enforced, and large camp systems gradually wound down. But resettlement didn't erase the rupture. Polish families now living in homes once belonging to Germans found traces of their predecessors. Children's toys in cupboards, diaries left in drawers, painted family names still visible under the whitewash. In Western Germany, villages absorbed streams of refugees from the east, whose bitterness at expulsion lingered long after roofs and jobs were secured. The sense of permanence, so easily destroyed during the war, did not return quickly. By 1950, Europe's great migrations had largely subsided, even if millions were never able to return to ancestral homes. Some regions stabilized under more ethnically uniform populations, while others continued to guard unresolved grievances. Communities rebuilt, families started over, but nearly everywhere the memory of expulsion, of hunger on the road, of nights spent waiting in the ruins left scars that would last through lifetimes. The magnitude of displacement after 1945 was not simply a humanitarian crisis. It reshaped the political balance of the continent, reinforced new borders, and hardened divisions already taking root. And in the center of it all, the nation that had provoked the war's destruction was itself left without sovereignty, its land carved into occupied zones whose uneasy coexistence carried the seeds of the next conflict. The division of Germany. Germany itself now became the test case for how peace would be managed. When the Nazi state collapsed in May 1945, it ceased to function as a government. Instead, what remained was divided into 4 occupied zones, controlled by the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and later France. These were not abstract lines on a map. They determined who fed which towns, which police answered to which headquarters, and who issued the permits for travel, housing, or property. What began as a military occupation quickly turned into civil administration, with soldiers functioning as governors overseeing daily survival. Even Berlin, situated deep inside the Soviet zone, was split into 4 sections, setting the capital apart as a contested symbol from the very beginning. In the first months, Allied patrols did sometimes operate side by side, clearing rubble, setting up food depots, or arranging transport for returning refugees. But this cooperation was always limited to immediate needs. As soon as broader goals came into play, differences emerged. The Soviet Union pressed for reparations and industrial dismantling, while Britain and the United States focused on stabilization and recovery. What looked like joint administration on paper already hid 2 competing strategies for Germany's future. For the German civilians trapped inside these zones, life meant constant shortages. Cities were wrecked, farmland disrupted, and millions of people returned to find their homes destroyed or already occupied. In habitable neighborhoods, apartments were crammed with multiple families, while basements became crowded shelters for those with nothing. Ration tickets were issued, but official portions fell below what most adults needed to survive. Hunger quickly dominated public life, and with it came resentment, directed not only at foreign soldiers, but at neighbors who seemed to do slightly better under the same conditions. The sense of defeat did not disappear with the surrender. It was renewed every time someone queued for a loaf of bread that never arrived. Into this vacuum, new markets emerged. Cigarettes, chocolate, and military rations turned into currency as the Reichsmark collapsed in value. Shoes, soap, and potatoes became barter goods traded more reliably than any official ration card. Farmers sold produce for American cigarettes, while urban families learned to smuggle military supplies. In this system, survival often depended less on Allied distributions than on the black market networks that threaded through ruined cities. The arrangement fed families, but it also undermined faith in the occupying authorities, who never seemed able to outpace the informal economy. The divisions between zones soon ran deeper than hunger or trade. In the Soviet-controlled East, dismantling was systematic. Factories, machinery, even rail infrastructure were carefully packed and shipped eastward as reparations. Entire industrial plants vanished, hauled away to restock Soviet production. This was deliberate policy, not random looting, but the effect was clear. The East's economic recovery slowed dramatically. Workers left behind often stood idle, watching the means of their livelihood disappear. In the Western zones, the focus looked different, less about shipping material away than about managing shortages, enforcing order, and keeping markets functioning, however unevenly. Politics quickly revealed the contrast. In the Soviet sector, only communist-aligned parties were given space, while rivals found themselves forced into mergers or quietly dissolved. Newspapers and radio echoed the official line, stressing socialist ideals bound tightly to Soviet authority. Schools adjusted curricula, emphasizing loyalty to the new system. By comparison, the American and British zones experimented with reopening a spectrum of parties: Christian Democrats, socialists, liberals, under close supervision, but with less rigidity. For ordinary Germans, these differences mattered. One side looked increasingly like a single-party state, while the other cautiously suggested a return to political pluralism. The same contrast played out in agriculture. The Soviets pushed collective farming models, consolidating plots into state-directed holdings. Families accustomed to individual ownership suddenly worked for fixed quotas, regardless of output. In the Western sectors, officials prioritized rebuilding transport and trade links, cautiously encouraging markets to revive. Both sides struggled with the same ravaged landscape, but their choices created visibly different experiences. A family in the East might labor in a collective farm for rations, while one in the West sought profit from urban barter or hoped wages would return when small businesses reopened. Berlin was the sharpest example of how divided rule shaped everyday life. The city was carved into 4 districts, producing constant friction. East Berlin aligned itself with Moscow's approach, filled with socialist slogans and Soviet checkpoints. In the Western districts, where British and American supplies circulated, consumer goods and party offices reappeared first. Berliners crossed back and forth daily, trading on black markets, visiting relatives, or simply looking for food. But every checkpoint reminded them how provisional their unity was. The city stood as a miniature version of the broader conflict. Communities within all these sectors also struggled with questions of guilt and collaboration. Accusations about past loyalties circulated as civilians tried to resume ordinary life. Occupiers often relied on denunciations to determine who could return to schoolrooms, factory floors, or city administration. For village families, the label of Nazi supporter or profiteer could lock someone out of work or community acceptance. What looked like reconstruction from the outside was often experienced locally as a series of arguments, suspicions, and hidden resentments. By the late 1940s, economic policy made the opposing paths unmistakable. In 1948, Western authorities introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, stabilizing their zones almost overnight and setting the stage for rapid economic recovery. The Soviets refused to recognize it, sealing their zone off economically and responding with the Berlin blockade in an effort to force concessions. The Western Allies answered with the Berlin airlift, flying supplies into the city for nearly a year until the blockade was lifted. For Germans and outsiders alike, it was clear the zones were not temporary. They were hardening into two different states. In 1949, that reality was confirmed. In the Western zones, the Federal Republic of Germany was established with a democratic constitution and market system, closely linked to the United States and Britain. In the East, the German Democratic Republic took shape as a socialist state under Soviet control. What had begun as an administrative arrangement transformed irreversibly into a political border, one that would cut through families, livelihoods, and cultures for the next 40 years. The occupation defined Germany's post-war future, turning collapse into a frontline contest between rival powers. But while politics in Germany took shape in boardrooms and through military orders, elsewhere in Europe survival was decided with far greater brutality. Crowds celebrated victory in capitals, yet away from the parades, violence still claimed lives in staggering numbers. The hidden violence after war. What came next was something far darker than official announcements of peace suggested. Beneath the surface, Europe entered a period of hidden violence, reprisals, expulsions, purges, and civil wars that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The fighting had stopped, but in towns and villages across the continent, the end of one war slid into another, where neighbors turned on neighbors and governments sanctioned brutal population shifts. This violence was most visible in Eastern Europe, where expulsions became state policy. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans who had lived for generations in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Balkans were driven westward. Modern scholarship estimates that up to 2 million perished during these expulsions, dying not in battles, but in marches, overcrowded trains, and camps marked by disease, hunger, or assault. The expulsions were justified by leaders at Potsdam as necessary to stabilize new borders, but for ordinary civilians, they meant sudden exile with little warning. A familiar language or family name was enough to mark someone for violence. Poland, newly expanded westward under the Allies' agreements, illustrates the process. Entire German-speaking communities in Silesia and East Prussia were forced east to camps, then bundled into transports headed for what was left of Germany. Families often had a few hours to collect belongings before being turned out of their homes. New Polish settlers, themselves uprooted from territories ceded to the Soviet Union, moved into houses where furniture, tools, and even children's toys still sat in place. These forced exchanges of population were less organized migrations than relentless collisions of desperate people. In Czechoslovakia, German speakers were stripped of citizenship and compelled to identify themselves by white armbands or swastika tags. They were forbidden from public spaces, placed under curfew, and barred from businesses. By mid-1945, many were herded into improvised camps or driven out by mobs. The mass deportation of Sudeten Germans left hundreds of thousands dead or missing in the course of marches and holding camps. Violence was encouraged, not discouraged, by the new authorities, a sign that what was presented as justice was just as often raw revenge. In Yugoslavia, the story turned red with civil bloodshed. Partisan forces under Josip Broz Tito, victors over German occupation, launched a sweeping purge of Croatians connected to the Ustaše regime and Germans who had lived for centuries in the Banat and Vojvodina. Reliable estimates place the death toll of collaborators and ethnic targets at close to 70,000, executed or left to die in camps. What began as retribution for fascist atrocities bent quickly into mass killings that blurred the line between guilty and innocent. For survivors, the liberation of 1945 brought no relief. It only changed who held the weapons. Greece offered yet another variation, though the vacuum left by occupation spiraled into open conflict between monarchy-aligned forces and communist partisans. Between 1946 and 1949, civil war tore communities apart, killing at least 50,000. This was not a simple reckoning with collaborators, but a battle over the nation's political future. Villages were burned, families displaced, and executions carried out under rival flags. Greece's civil war underscored how uneven the pattern was. In some countries, post-war violence took the form of state-directed expulsions. In others, it descended into protracted internal war. Beyond these headline cases, everyday reprisals happened at the local level. Wartime collaborators, or those accused of collaboration, were dragged into streets, beaten, or executed in the absence of functioning courts. Many accusations came from personal grudges disguised as patriotism. In Romania and Hungary, trials of wartime officials filled courtrooms, but verdicts as often followed political expedience as evidence. Even among former resistance movements, rival factions now turned on one another, branding yesterday's allies as traitors. Archival research has since revealed just how widespread and unrecorded this hidden violence was. In southwest Poland, dozens of small massacres of German civilians in 1945 and 1946 remained absent from official histories for decades. In Czechoslovakia, death marches of Sudeten Germans across summer landscapes left many thousands dead of exposure, starvation, or outright assault. In Yugoslavia, the wave of executions against Croats and Germans rivaled in scale some of the worst massacres of the war itself. These were not isolated excesses, but repeated patterns that scarred entire communities. At the same time, post-war governments used the atmosphere of vengeance to secure their hold on power. Communist regimes in Eastern Europe folded their political opponents into the same category as collaborators. In Poland, members of the Home Army, the underground that had fought German occupation, were arrested, tortured, and executed under the label of fascist sympathizers. Violence blurred into governance, punishing enemies, reshaping identity, and erasing rival parties became instruments of state building. In rural Ukraine, nationalist insurgencies kept fighting long after Germany had surrendered. Soviet authorities battled these groups for years, burning villages and deporting families in a prolonged cycle of ambush and reprisal. For civilians, this meant life under military patrols, suspicion of neighbors, and persistent fear well into the late 1940s. In such places, the line between wartime and peacetime erased itself entirely. The toll of this hidden violence is hard to measure precisely. What emerges from the best scholarship is a conservative but devastating count. Between 1 and 2 million people may have been killed in Europe during expulsions, ethnic cleansings, reprisals, and civil wars in the 5 years after 1945. They did not die on conventional battlefields, but in forced marches through mud, in makeshift camps, or at the edges of forests where mass graves were hurriedly dug. For many communities, 1945 was not remembered as the first year of peace, but as the beginning of another cycle of terror. The decades that followed preferred a different memory. Official histories celebrated resistance, recovery, and national renewal, while the pain of expulsions and massacres was pushed aside. Only later, as witnesses spoke and archives opened, did these hidden stories gain recognition as part of Europe's real post-war legacy. The paradox is that while nations trumpeted triumph, families carried the silence of exile and murder from generation to generation. Even by the close of the 1940s, when expulsions and civil war slowed, the scars remained carved into the landscape. Empty villages, erased communities, and borderlands permanently altered. While the guns had been silenced, violence remained embedded in the settlement of Europe. And as survivors tried to rebuild their lives, they did so not only among shattered populations, but within cities reduced to ruins, where the very ground beneath them had collapsed into rubble awaiting clearance. Cities buried in rubble. Entire cities stood silent beneath mountains of broken stone, shattered walls, and twisted steel. By 1945, over one-third of Europe's urban centers were reduced to ruins. Streets no longer led anywhere, squares had collapsed into jagged fields, and whole districts were nothing but heaps of ash and rubble. In Berlin, the devastation stretched for miles without pause, block after block outlined only by gutted walls. Warsaw lay almost entirely leveled, whole neighborhoods reduced to foundations. The scale extended across the continent. The Soviet Union recorded tens of thousands of destroyed villages and more than 1,000 towns lost, while in Germany, alone millions of housing units were obliterated. It meant that before reconstruction could even be imagined, something else had to happen first, the monumental task of clearing away the debris. Every collapsed building was both a scar and a practical obstacle. Streets buried under wreckage could not be reopened for trams or cars. Homes could not be rebuilt on lands still covered in ruins. The first chapter of recovery was therefore demolition on a continental scale. And it had to be done under the harshest conditions. Tens of millions of tons of rubble shifted mostly by hand, with no sufficient supply of heavy machines, little access to fuel, and almost no financial resources to pay workers. Cities were stripped of industry, economies were drained, and even surviving trucks and bulldozers were either destroyed or diverted to the occupying armies. Clearing a single block often came down to wheelbarrows, wooden carts, and the sheer endurance of laborers using their own hands. The sounds of post-war Europe were not cranes or engines, but picks shattering concrete and shovels scraping into piles. It was exhausting, slow work that stretched on not for weeks, but for years. In Germany, women took up this burden most visibly. With men dead, missing, or imprisoned as prisoners of war, teams of women became the workforce of rubble clearance. Known as the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, they dismantled ruins brick by brick, cleaning mortar with hammers so that each piece could be reused. The salvaged bricks became the backbone of early reconstruction. Every one recovered meant one less to manufacture in an economy that had no functioning factories. Photographs show chains of women passing bricks hand to hand through the dust, their clothing ragged, their fingers cracked and bleeding. These scenes were repeated in every major German city, turning ruined neighborhoods into improvised workshops of recovery. Elsewhere, the challenge and labor were much the same. Warsaw, obliterated after the failed uprising, saw vast volunteer brigades clearing the central city. Teams worked street by street, salvaging what they could and piling reusable brick into neat stacks. In Stalingrad, entire factories had to be dismantled by hand, severing metal girders with hacksaws and melting down fragments for reuse. Even to reopen a single tramline could take months. For residents who had survived the siege or the bombings, the only option was to carve out survival in cellars or makeshift shelters in the ruins, waiting while slow progress eventually cleared land for new blocks. The danger of clearing operations was constant. Ruined walls could collapse without warning. Mines or unexploded shells were buried under debris, ready to detonate with one misplaced swing of a shovel. Beyond the physical threats, human remains, long trapped in basements or cellars, were uncovered during the work. Survivors spoke of the grim routine of finding bones or decomposed bodies as they dug. Each pile was not only rubble, but also a reminder of the violence that had brought the city down. Despite this, salvage was relentless and often ingenious. Rails were lifted from destroyed tramlines and pressed into new service. Roof tiles, glass shards and bricks were sorted and reused. Shortages of fuel forced reliance on pure human stamina. Helmets became kitchen strainers, while old weapon parts found new use as tools. In this strange economy of scarcity, every fragment of debris became potential material. What had once symbolized destruction was recycled into the raw supply of survival. By 1946, tangible progress was visible. Streets that had been thought permanently blocked were reopened. In Berlin, massive piles of debris were heaped into artificial hills on the city's outskirts, where they became lasting markers of the clearance effort. In Warsaw, a journalist remarked with awe, "Wherever you look, you can see the works begun," capturing the mood of recovery, taking root among the ruins. Trams carrying passengers rattled down avenues that only months before had been smothered under debris. These labors stitched fractured societies back together. People who had lost nearly everything still came out daily to shovel, hammer, and carry, finding purpose in the act of removal. It was not glamorous, and it brought little immediate comfort, but it created the conditions without which no reconstruction plan could succeed. The Marshall Plan, new urban designs, even the industrial revival of the 1950s, all of these depended first on ground cleared by exhausted workers moving stone by hand. Yet progress was slow, uneven, and incomplete. Even by the late 1940s, entire districts in Warsaw, Berlin, and Stalingrad remained heaps of ruin. Rebuilding would consume the next decades and would never fully replace what was lost. Much of modern Europe's cityscape rests on ground first leveled under dust, with reused bricks stacked into new walls that literally embodied the memory of destruction. The transformation was profound but fragile. Streets and tramlines reopened. Apartment blocks rose on land once buried in ruins. Industrial plants restarted on sites only recently uncovered. The immediate post-war achievement was not glittering reconstruction, but the survival of cities themselves through hard, unending labor. It showed that even with limited tools and crushing shortages, urban life could return. But as the rubble shifted and the outlines of new streets appeared, a deeper problem became impossible to ignore. Clearing debris made space for rebuilding, yet millions still had no roofs to stand beneath once the wreckage was gone. Survivors emerged from cellars or returned from camps to find not only cities leveled, but housing all but erased. The next challenge, as decisive as removing the ruins themselves, was where these people would live. A housing crisis without end. By 1946, Europe faced a crisis that went beyond clearing rubble or searching for food. Millions, tens of millions, were left without permanent housing, their apartments gone along with whole city districts. The numbers are stark. Germany alone lost more than 3.6 million housing units, and France saw nearly 2 million buildings damaged or destroyed. In Warsaw, entire neighborhoods no longer existed at all, the city reduced to near foundations after systematic demolition. These losses meant that for a vast population returning from camps, exile, or evacuation, there was simply nowhere habitable to return to. Improvised shelters became the only answer. Families dug into the cold cellars of half-standing buildings, dark storage spaces that quickly turned into crowded dwellings. Damp air clung to walls, mold crept across ceilings, and air shafts stuffed with rags became the only defense against winter winds. Scrapped boards or scavenged doors partitioned basements into tight compartments, where multiple families slept side by side. Illnesses flourished in such spaces: coughing children, fever-stricken elders, stomach sickness from contaminated water. For many, these cellars became home for months or even years. Others returned to the upper floors of bombed-out buildings, despite the danger. Roofs had collapsed, staircases teetered, and gaps gaped in exterior walls. Yet desperation forced people to camp in what remained. Open beams were patched with tarps ripped from military stockpiles. Blankets and cardboard stood in for shattered glass. Chimneys refitted from stove parts belched smoke into hollow stairwells as families cooked meals among the rubble. Fires kept inhabitants alive through the cold, but the risk of collapse or accident hovered constantly over them. Railway carriages, lined up in sidings and stripped of their original purpose, turned into entire wagon villages. Families squeezed into compartments with baggage as makeshift beds, heating stoves perched in corridors, and chimneys poking through carriage windows. Although crude, these train communities offered solid walls and roofs, a degree of protection missing in ruins. Temporary wagon settlements sprang up outside major stations and often lasted for years, stray neighborhoods on steel rails where children grew up never having known a normal house. Relief agencies, including UNRRA camps for displaced persons, documented such arrangements alongside the formal DP camps that tried to group families waiting for resettlement. Scarcity of building materials compounded everything. With industry wrecked, bricks salvaged from rubble were vital, cleaned one by one for reuse. Cement, timber, and glass barely circulated. Transport bottlenecks made even available supplies inaccessible. Families scavenged, salvaging nails, beams, and tins from wreckage. Gardens grew in the craters left by collapsed buildings, courtyards planted with vegetables to support precarious survival. Firewood came not from forests, but from the demolition of ruined houses. Every act of rebuilding consumed remnants of the destroyed past. Crowding made conditions worse. In cities where a few apartments stood habitable, they were packed with multiple families, sometimes strangers assigned by local authorities. Shared kitchens divided among 4 or 5 households inevitably sparked quarrels, while rooms designed for children now held entire families. Meanwhile, occupation authorities requisitioned surviving housing for troops or for administrative staff, forcing civilians into even harsher alternatives. Resentment simmered as residents saw scarce roofs handed over to soldiers while they slept in basements or ruins. The winters were merciless. With no glass available, makeshift window coverings of rags or paper let wind and cold tear through. Furniture and books fed stoves, while children huddled under thin blankets against frost. Respiratory illnesses, bronchitis, and pneumonia spread easily among the undernourished, and hospitals, often damaged themselves, could offer little. Survival was a calculation measured by how much wood a family could scavenge that day, or which belongings could be sacrificed for fuel. The creativity of households in this climate of scarcity was relentless. Helmets became cooking pots. Lengths of steel tubing, once part of anti-tank launchers, found new life as spades or tools. Rubber stripped from tires made serviceable soles for worn shoes. Ammunition crates hammered into rough furniture-lined rooms. Parachute fabric hung over windows as curtains. Each item scavenged from the battlefield or ruin was pressed into daily service, often for years. Necessity drove this ingenuity, creating homes where conventional furnishings and domestic goods were entirely absent. These improvisations testified to resilience as much as desperation. Returning workers found they had no place to lodge but a rail car or basement. Couples married and began family life in half-standing shells of buildings. Children grew up playing in rubble instead of courtyards. Emergency relief offered food and medical care, but the sheer scale of the housing crisis left most to their own devices. Even where aid organizations maintained displaced persons camps, these could only hold a fraction of those in need. By the later 1940s, construction finally began to take on scale. New apartment blocks rose, bricks salvaged from ruins stacked into neat rows. Some cities, like Warsaw, debated whether to recreate the old cityscape or pursue modern designs. In Britain, government decrees authorized the building of entirely new towns, while in France, regional reconstruction programs emphasized modern housing estates. But even as progress accelerated, the backlog remained enormous. Families endured years before ever moving into a proper dwelling. For those who had spent winters in rail cars or basements, the memory lingered. Household tools fashioned from war scrap remained in use long into the 1950s, long after necessity had passed. The scars of homelessness defined daily life beyond any temporary headlines. The war had ended, but the absence of roofs pressed its weight into every corner of Europe, shaping not only personal endurance, but long-range policies of reconstruction and urban renewal. The housing crisis stretched across nations unevenly, but its imprint was everywhere. In the recycled bricks built into fresh walls, in the improvised utensils found in kitchens, and in the memories of generations who had learned to survive without true shelter. It reminds us that the challenges of peace were not abstract or distant, but measured in cold cellars, overcrowded rooms, and settlements on railway tracks. And beneath this struggle for space lay a parallel challenge: the breakdown of the economic systems that might have enabled quicker recovery. With currencies near worthless, industries idle, and trade networks shattered, households not only lacked homes, but also the means to sustain ordinary life. The crisis of roofs soon intertwined with the larger question of how to restart an economy that had all but collapsed. Economic survival and recovery. Europe's survival after 1945 was measured not just in the clearing of ruins, but in whether economies could function at all. National currencies lay effectively broken. Banknotes that had once carried the weight of wages and taxes became slips of paper with no meaning. Shops either closed their shutters or sat empty, while industrial networks were silent, their machines rusting and workshops stripped of raw materials. Fuel was gone, electricity unreliable, and even intact factories stood idle. Markets did not disappear, but survival meant trading in barns, side streets, and back rooms, in an economy where barter carried more weight than any official coin. Returning workers found the collapse firsthand. Prisoners of war, freed laborers, and evacuees walked back to workshops and mines only to see broken machinery, floorboards ripped apart, and storerooms emptied of coal or steel. Transport links had been blasted apart by bombing raids. Entire districts were dismantled outright and carted off in reparations. The capacity to restart industry required more than available labor. Without power, inputs, or distribution, the production lines would not shift. With little food and less pay, stream after stream of workers abandoned cities and drifted back into the countryside, bartering for meals while machines stayed cold. A barter economy filled the void. Cigarettes became the most reliable unit of value, traded in rationed sticks or packs for food, clothing, or shelter. Allied soldiers unwittingly supplied this new currency from their rations, which filtered into civilian hands where they quickly held more trust than cash. Soap carried equal weight, scarce and indispensable. Even grain and flour were pressed into service as means of exchange. Streets in ruined cities became markets humming with these tokens, the real arteries of survival. In German towns, people described the cigarette economy as universal. A carpenter repaired a chair for 3 packs, a teacher offered lessons for 2, and farmers traded potatoes for smokes in every railway station. Families pooled their cigarette stock in the same way others once pooled wages. For military-minded observers, it mirrored the improvisational currencies of battlefield outposts, where chocolate, tobacco, or soap substituted for coins and handled logistics as much as leisure. The black markets that sustained this exchange blurred lines of morality. Soldiers, supplies leaked into alleys, sold again at prices many could not afford. Traders cut profits while neighbors barely survived. Yet without these markets, millions would have starved. Occupation authorities tried to police them, but lacked both manpower and the sympathy of locals who depended on them. In practice, this informal economy was far more efficient than any official rationing system, operating in shadows, yet powering daily life. National economies reeled under the damage. France, exhausted by occupation, had factories gutted and transport systems shattered. Germany's industrial base was gutted. Steel and heavy industry were especially hard hit, leaving whole production chains inert. In the East, specialized industrial regions were left cut off from their natural suppliers and markets, with plants effectively frozen. Populations, too, had shifted. The loss of millions of skilled young men from death, injury, or displacement left workforces skewed and unable to provide the hands technical recovery demanded. Transport bottlenecks compounded the paralysis. Bombing campaigns had deliberately crippled supply networks, and by 1945, around 40% of Germany's rail network was unusable. Bridges were down, rail yards gutted, and rivers blocked by wrecks or mines. Even factories capable of producing steel or coal could not distribute their goods across broken infrastructure. Reconstruction of industry therefore depended as much on repairing tracks and bridges as reopening production floors. Policy diverged rapidly between occupation zones. In the Soviet sector, dismantling was deliberate. Plants disassembled part by part, machinery crated and sent eastward as reparations. Skilled workers and engineers either followed their equipment unwillingly or fled west in search of prospects. Economic recovery there slowed, its once rich industrial base stripped and hollowed out. In the American and British zones, tentative reconstruction began. Authorities experimented with stabilizing currencies, reopened trade links, and invested resources into slowly restarting factories. By 1947, these decisions planted the origins of what later would be labeled an economic miracle, while the East hemorrhaged resources and personnel. For families, the collapse showed itself not in charts, but in kitchens. Evening meals meant thin soup stretched from a carrot or cabbage grown in an allotment garden. Heat came from scavenged wood or dismantled furniture. Clothing would be patched endlessly, shoes resoled with scraps of tire rubber pried from barracks dumps. Mothers carried soap bars or cigarette packs into marketplaces to bargain for bread or potatoes, returning home with whatever a long trade chain could yield. Formal wages meant little. Survival was accounted in barter goods and endurance. Still, small advances came. By 1946, coal mines reopened under firm military oversight. Smelters restarted in partial runs. Train lines bulged with repairs and carried wagons slowly across rejoined networks. Families saw plumes of factory smoke begin to rise again, reminders that industry had not died altogether. Job markets revived, weakly at first, but often enough to pull workers away from shadows into partly formal employment. The gap between regions showed ever more clearly. Western Europe benefited from gradual stabilization of currencies and the reopening of trade. By 1947, international responses framed the challenge more directly. That June, the Marshall Plan was announced, pledging more than $13 billion in aid to Western Europe. Funding, supplies, and expertise meant not only to rebuild economies, but also to secure political stability. These resources accelerated industrial recovery and reintegrated markets, reinforcing Europe's West-East split. In Eastern Europe, however, economies remained more dependent on rigid state systems, managing shortages through centralized rationing under harsher conditions. Households carried the brunt of this uneven pace. In a street where shops reopened in one sector, another only a mile away remained silent under closures. Families saw visibly how different choices reshaped livelihoods. Neighbors to the west gained greater access to imported goods. Those in the east grappled with shortages that stretched long past the war years. The politics of the Cold War were being sketched in daily bread lines and factory shifts. By 1948, currencies in the Western zones stabilized further. A new Deutschmark replaced the hollow Reichsmark, restoring trust in wages and trade. Barter diminished, but did not vanish, replaced slowly by markets in actual cash. In the east, shortages persisted, rationing continued, and migration westward accelerated. The continent's economic story was no longer only about recovery, but about the divide forming within that recovery. What had begun in rubble and barter economies of cigarettes and soap shifted, within just a few years, toward trade, aid, and fragile but visible growth. Markets reopened, machine tools clattered again, and transport lines connected regions once more. Even so, for many families, daily life remained a fragile calculation. Would wages stretch to food? Would heat last the winter? Would shoes survive until summer? Among those most exposed to this uncertainty were the youngest. Europe's children moved through these ruined markets, these fragile kitchens, these barter streets, not merely as observers, but as the most vulnerable to hunger and neglect. Their experiences lay at the heart of what survival meant after the war. Children of the rubble. Among the ruins of post-war Europe, the most haunting figures were the children wandering through broken streets. Barefoot, dressed in scraps, clutching tins or crusts of bread, they stood out as symbols not only of destroyed cities, but of families torn apart. Contemporary counts estimated more than 200,000 homeless children in Germany's cities alone, while Poland faced the greatest burden. nearly 1 million children living without parents or secure shelter. They could be seen at stations, in cellars, or perched on collapsed walls, lingering in groups as they tried to piece together some means of survival. Reasons were brutally varied. Some had lost parents to deportations or camps. Others were left behind by sudden air raids, partisan warfare, or expulsions that scattered families across shifting borders. Population transfers and forced marches that drove millions from Eastern Europe left children stranded midway, separated from adults in the chaos. The war not only erased homes, but shattered households, scattering young lives into a landscape with too few ways to find stability again. In Berlin and Warsaw, people came to call them children of the rubble. The name fit too well, small figures climbing through collapsed beams, scavenging among stone piles, using ruins as both playgrounds and shelters. Gangs formed for protection, older children caring for younger ones, creating fragile surrogate families. Their skills were limited, gathering scraps of food, stripping wood to light fires, searching for dry corners to sleep. But even such simple strategies were life and death when adults themselves struggled to eat. Aid organizations recognized the crisis, but were quickly overwhelmed. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRRA, charged with organizing displaced persons camps, declared children a priority. Yet the resources to care for them all simply did not exist. Thousands evaded even the efforts to count them, drifting into camps one day and vanishing the next. Tracing systems based on names and records faltered when many of the youngest didn't know their own surnames or birthplaces. It became clear that countless children would never be formally identified, much less reunited with relatives. Some of those found went into labor camps or informal work brigades, hard work, but a ration of food at least. Others were absorbed into foster arrangements. Families sometimes offered true care. Just as often they used children as unpaid labor in fields or homes. Black markets in adoption thrived, especially across borders, where desperate childless families took in orphans under loose oversight. Without functioning civil registries, many arrangements slipped into permanent obscurity, leaving no trail for future reunions. Poland provided the clearest sense of scale. With nearly 1 million children unprotected, any institution meant to house or care for them filled immediately beyond capacity. Schools reopened slowly, but the classrooms were filled with children weakened by malnutrition and scarred by loss. Teachers faced more than lessons. They carried responsibility for sickness, hunger, and grief, day after day. Learning to read and write became only a part of the larger task of turning scattered, traumatized children back into students. In Germany, stories were different, but no less bleak. Children of bombed-out districts scavenged near Allied kitchens, hoping for leftovers. Train carriages parked in wrecked stations became impromptu dormitories. Many children were sons and daughters of ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, arriving suddenly in ruined German cities with no adult relatives left to claim them. Foster care systems were overwhelmed, leaving countless children to fend for themselves. Allied soldiers and relief workers described their presence everywhere, scavenging near barracks, sleeping under tarpaulins, moving in groups across ruined courtyards. The psychological scars were deep and lasting. Children who grew up without support learned quickly to barter or steal to survive. Years spent in rubble or camps hardened them to mistrust and survival at any cost. Those separated from relatives often never found them again, and many disappeared into missing files, undocumented fosterings, or irregular adoptions. A whole generation's early memories became inseparable from deprivation, dislocation, and the pressure of survival. Relief agencies did attempt to create stability, although results were uneven. Orphanages and community shelters were patched together inside ruined buildings, staffed by volunteers and priests. Children gathered there for food, clothing, or the semblance of a classroom. Simple activities, singing, drawing, or learning letters, were introduced not only as education, but as attempts to restore normal childhood. Within this grim context, moments of grace mattered. In the Soviet zone, radio and newspaper campaigns helped trace families. and by the end of the 1940s, nearly 300,000 children were reunited with relatives through such efforts. Small though this was compared to the overall need, it gave evidence that some searches did succeed. Still, most remained beyond the reach of these measures. Orphans moved from street life into labor, merged into unauthorized foster homes, or simply vanished into the wider movement of displaced populations. For many, the outcome was permanent separation, a childhood absorbed not by recovery, but by disappearance into the gaps of record-keeping. Even the best-meaning authorities acknowledged that records would never be complete. Behind every statistic stood lives that had simply gone missing. Within this shattered demographic, some resilience surfaced. Children who remained in camps or shelters eventually entered reopened schools by the early 1950s. Their return marked a step toward ordinary civic life, as teachers, social workers, and neighbors tried to rebuild not only lessons, but trust and order. Photographs from this period show children helping plant gardens amid ruins or crowding into makeshift classrooms, visible symbols of both what had been destroyed and what could, however imperfectly, be renewed. The children of the rubble embodied loss and survival at once. They showed that destruction was not confined to bricks and factories, that the damage extended to those too young to defend themselves. Yet their presence also forced societies to rebuild, because their survival demanded more than walls or roads. It required stability in households, in schools, and in communities. It was in these faces, amid the hunger and the missing records, that Europe could read the depth of its crisis. But the years after 1945 brought not only efforts to heal these wounds. While orphans wandered shattered streets and families fought to resume ordinary life, governments and occupying powers moved in very different directions, imposing new systems and new controls. Out of a landscape already fractured by war, another kind of division was about to take hold, one that would shape the continent just as fundamentally as the rebuilding of its homes. Birth of the Cold War. While Europe's families struggled to survive each day, governments and armies were already shaping a new confrontation that would define the continent for decades. The Second World War had ended with the United States and the Soviet Union standing as the two strongest victors, but their partnership dissolved almost immediately. What replaced it was not open battle, but a contest fought through politics, diplomacy, and competing visions for Europe's future. This was the birth of the Cold War. For Joseph Stalin, the catastrophe of invasion was still fresh. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million citizens, its towns and industries scarred by occupation and destruction. Stalin resolved never again to leave his country vulnerable along its western frontier. The solution was not only military garrisons, but political control. Moscow moved quickly to ensure that every state along its border would be governed by loyal regimes, forming a protective belt of security as much as an expansion of ideology. From Moscow's perspective, installing Communist Party officials into ministries and police ranks was as much a defensive measure as it was revolutionary. This strategy unfolded in Eastern Europe. Parties still campaigned, elections were declared, and coalitions appeared on ballot lists, but behind this surface lay systematic intervention. Communist officials were placed into justice departments, interior ministries, and state police, giving them authority over courts and security. Once established, they used intimidation, arrests, and administrative blocks against rivals. By 1947, parliaments that looked plural were already functioning in practice as institutions bound to Moscow. Ordinary voters often only discovered their lack of choice once ballots yielded implausibly uniform majorities favoring the communists. Examples multiplied across the region. In Romania, magistrates who resisted communist policy were quietly dismissed, and elections were managed through coercion and ballot manipulation. In Hungary, opponents of the regime were eliminated through staged trials, with arrests ensuring that only one outcome remained possible. While these methods varied in detail, the results converged. From Bulgaria to Poland, institutions that had briefly promised democracy became organs reinforcing the Soviet model. What emerged was not a union of partners, but a bloc held fast by one-party rule. The West grew increasingly unsettled as this pattern unfolded. Observers in Washington and London saw not simply border defense, but the deliberate subjugation of half the continent. In March 1946, Winston Churchill gave public voice to these concerns. Speaking at Fulton, Missouri, he warned that an iron curtain was descending across Europe. At first, some dismissed the words as overstatement, yet the image proved unforgettable. A vivid line now seemed to divide East from West, nations under plural politics on one side, and those where opposition was systematically silenced on the other. Events soon demonstrated how sharp that divide could be. Czechoslovakia initially attempted to balance its alliances, cooperating with the Soviets while preserving multi-party politics. President Edvard Beneš hoped to avoid extremes, but that fragile balance collapsed in February 1948. Communist ministers, backed by Moscow, used control of police and militias to drive opponents out of government. The death within days of Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, found beneath a ministry window under contested circumstances, symbolized the end of that experiment. With the coup complete, Czechoslovakia stood fully behind the curtain, one more democracy extinguished. Across Western capitals, suspicion hardened into firm conviction. Stalin's measures were no longer seen as temporary precautions, but as deliberate expansion. Public declarations still spoke of cooperation, yet behind them policy shifted. In March 1947, President Harry Truman set out what became known as the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support for nations resisting communism. The following year, the United States advanced the Marshall Plan, a program of economic aid designed both to revive Western Europe's industries and to shield them from political collapse. Together, these measures signaled that the perceived Soviet threat would be answered by an equally determined Western program. But this was more than speeches and aid. The refugees scattered throughout Europe became entangled in the rivalry. Western authorities did not recognize the Soviet annexation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1940. As a result, Baltic refugees in Allied zones were not considered Soviet citizens and were usually spared repatriation. Moscow, however, rejected this distinction. Soviet officers at repatriation boards insisted that all Baltic peoples were now legally Soviet and demanded their return. For civilians, whether they could remain in the West became a matter of geopolitics, as personal identity collided with the demands of competing superpowers. At the same time, the global stage framed these splits. Created to prevent another world war, the United Nations quickly revealed its weaknesses. As permanent members of the Security Council, both Washington and Moscow wielded veto power, blocking any measure that might challenge their interests. This transformed the Council into a theater of accusation rather than solution, with speeches and rebuttals replacing binding resolutions. If the organization had been meant as a pillar of collective security, in practice, it showed only how irreconcilable the new division was becoming. For ordinary Europeans, these high-level rivalries touched daily life in concrete ways. In Warsaw and across the Soviet zone, collectivization stripped farmers of land and folded them into state-directed enterprises. Small businesses vanished under central control. By contrast, in West Germany and France, American economic advisors pushed currency reforms that stabilized markets and reopened shops. These were not just abstract policies. They determined whether bread reached tables, whether teachers had books, or whether apartment construction went forward. Residents in each half of Europe lived under rival systems that shaped their recovery at the most basic level. By 1948, Churchill's warning no longer seemed dramatic. Barbed wire, checkpoints, and soldiers now marked genuine frontiers. Families divided by geography found themselves divided by political systems. In the West, parties competed, newspapers published criticism, and markets revived under international aid. In the East, opposition was outlawed, security forces grew in power, and daily life came under closer control of the state. The Iron Curtain was not metaphorical. It was patrolled, documented, and enforced. The Cold War emerged not through declaration, but through accumulation. Communists advancing into ministries, critics silenced by trial or intimidation, speeches from Western leaders framing the conflict as existential, rival aid programs shaping economies. These fragments combined into a structure that divided the continent. Even as Europe's houses were rebuilt and factories restarted, every policy was weighed, not only for its practical impact, but for the side it seemed to favor. Two different Europes were taking shape, and with them, a new global alignment of power. As the 1940s neared their end, the struggle was no longer whether Europe would recover, but under whose vision that recovery would proceed. Some governments rebuilt institutions under American and British sponsorship. Others fell into the Soviet sphere, reconstructed to serve Moscow's security needs and ideological design. The continent's survival was no longer simply about clearing rubble or resettling refugees. It had become a contest over futures. And at the center of that contest stood a new question. Could economic revival itself determine the political fate of nations? For Western leaders, the answer lay in a bold program of aid that promised to rescue economies from collapse before communism could take deeper root. The Marshall Plan and economic transformation. By the late 1940s, the shape of Europe's recovery was beginning to shift. Relief efforts and clearing rubble had laid the groundwork, but survival alone could not secure the long-term future of governments or economies. What followed was the launch of a structured recovery plan, officially called the European Recovery Program, but remembered everywhere by the name of the American Secretary of State who proposed it, George C. Marshall. Announced in 1947 and enacted the following year, the Marshall Plan committed roughly $13 billion in direct aid to 16 European countries between 1948 and 1951, a figure equal to about $130 billion in today's currency. The scope of it was without precedent. It was not presented as charity, but as a concrete policy designed to restore productive capacity, stabilize societies, and prevent political collapse through economic strength. At its core, the strategy was simple: make Europe's factories, fields, and ports operate again, and in doing so, eliminate the hunger and unemployment that fueled unrest. Aid distribution was neither automatic nor unconditional. Participating states had to demonstrate plans for how funds would be invested, and just as importantly, they were required to cooperate with one another. The United States insisted that assistance would work best if nations synchronized their trade and reduced barriers to economic exchange. Coordination agreements ensured supplies did not overlap and encouraged cross-border projects. In effect, the Marshall Plan forced former rivals to sit at the same table and plan continent-wide recovery together. This unexpected requirement to cooperate planted early seeds for integration that would later give rise to organizations like the European Coal and Steel Community. On the ground, the shipments that arrived were striking for their practicality. Coal trains began moving again, bringing fuel not just for stoves, but for power stations driving entire industrial regions. Machine tools, spare parts, and production equipment allowed factories to reopen, restoring wages and output that had sat idle for years. Such emblematic flows carried symbolic importance well beyond their tonnage, signaling that broken economies could be restarted with focused investment. For city dwellers, it meant markets slowly regained variety, bakeries kept bread on counters, and lights stayed on through the night with dependable electricity. The changes were visible across key centers. In the Netherlands, deliveries of fuel eased the shortages that had once forced families to burn furniture during the hunger winter. In France, aid stabilized the franc and allowed industries to repair railways and power grids, reconnecting major urban regions. In West Germany, factories long dependent on salvaged tools were suddenly equipped with modern machinery, allowing production runs impossible only the year before. Newspapers published images of aid shipments unloading at ports, greeted not with fanfare, but with relief, as people realized shortages would not endure forever. For ordinary citizens, improvements were measured in small but vital gains. Workers returned to employment that offered real wages rather than inflated currency. Farmers saw their fields produce improved yields thanks to fertilizers and better equipment. Students studied by lamplight instead of candle stubs. The return of trams, stocked markets, and reliable heat carried a psychological effect as strong as the material one. Recovery no longer seemed theoretical, but something families felt at the level of daily life. Politically, the Marshall Plan had clear consequences. In Italy and France, where communist parties had grown powerful in the immediate post-war years, the economic support of the United States helped balance the scales. As shortages eased, the appeal of radical alternatives softened. This did not mean Western Europe turned uniformly prosperous overnight, but the reduction of visible desperation gave fragile democratic governments critical space to survive. Marshall aid thus became more than an economic tool. It was a stabilizing force in societies where political loyalties had been in flux. Moscow, however, interpreted the program as an intrusion. Stalin saw it as a Trojan horse, designed not simply to repair economies, but to pull them firmly into an American orbit. Accepting dollars, goods, and the requirement of economic cooperation would have meant conceding sovereignty of policy to Western systems. In response, Stalin categorically forbade all Soviet-aligned countries from joining. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, although devastated and initially interested, were compelled to withdraw. In their place, Moscow organized a set of centralized trade and production arrangements for its sphere, directing resources eastward and binding its allies through systems that reinforced the division. The refusal deepened the divide in lived experience. By 1950, families in Rotterdam, Lyon, and Frankfurt reported improved wages, wider availability of food, and the easing of rationing. Meanwhile, residents of Sofia, Warsaw, or Budapest faced supply chains still racked by shortages and prolonged utility blackouts. While both East and West had suffered the same wartime devastation, the speed with which improvements arrived diverged dramatically. The effect was not instant prosperity, but a gradual and unmistakable contrast. Relief on one side of the continent, stubborn scarcity on the other. Equally significant was how the Marshall Plan engineered modernization. Rather than only replacing what had been destroyed, it directed funds into structural improvements, upgraded energy systems, mechanized agriculture, and more efficient industrial equipment. By increasing productivity, it fashioned a platform for sustained growth after direct aid ended. Within a few years, observers began describing an economic miracle, a phrase that would later define West Germany's rapid resurgence, but applied more broadly to the trajectory of recovery in the West. What began as survival assistance evolved into the basis of lasting transformation. The broader consequences reached far beyond output totals. Aid had pulled Western Europe into a coherent bloc, both economically and politically, linked firmly to Washington. At the same time, Stalin's rejection of the program and creation of alternative arrangements confirmed that economic recovery would proceed along two divergent paths. This reinforced the reality of two Europes, one rebuilt with American material and technical support, the other sealed into Soviet planning and insulated from Western markets. Seen from the perspective of 1951, the continent's division was no longer temporary, it had hardened into structure. For governments and citizens living through it, the plan represented more than the arrival of American cargo ships. It had redefined their options. Those who participated found themselves integrated into a Western system of trade and democratic politics. Those who abstained, either by choice or by imposition, endured slower, state-driven recovery. The Marshall Plan was economic aid, but at the level of geopolitics, it acted as an engine of alignment, locking Europe into two spheres whose borders grew sharper with each passing year. By the start of the 1950s, Western Europe's recovery was evident in reopened shops, humming factories, and currency stability. Eastern Europe's shortages, by contrast, hardened into a feature of daily life. The Marshall Plan had altered infrastructure, output, and livelihoods, But its most enduring legacy was the way it mapped the future trajectory of Europe. Not one broad revival, but two separate economic systems in permanent competition. And it was within this divided world that a confrontation soon arrived. A test of strength not over factories or currency, but over whether an entire city could be forced into submission. Europe's political contest was about to be fought not in parliaments or accounts, but in a capital suddenly cut off from the outside. Berlin, the battle without bombs. In the summer of 1948, Berlin became the most visible fault line of the Cold War. It was here that Joseph Stalin chose to measure Western resolve with a direct challenge. Overnight, all road, rail, and canal routes into the city's western sectors were blocked. Trains were halted, trucks were turned back at checkpoints, and barges sat stranded outside the city. For over 2 million West Berliners, the message was unambiguous. Without access to supplies, their survival was in jeopardy. The blockade's purpose was clear. If Britain, France, and the United States abandoned West Berlin, the entire city would fall under Soviet control. The move followed a decision that seemed at first glance to be technical, but carried major weight. On June 23, 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutschmark into their occupation zones, including in West Berlin. Stable currency was essential for rebuilding, and the Soviets refused to allow its circulation within territory they still claimed influence over. To Moscow, the reform was more than economics. It threatened Soviet leverage in Germany. Within hours of the new notes entering circulation, rail lines and highways into the city were sealed. West Berlin was left a political island, cut off inside Soviet territory. The Western response was to attempt what many initially considered impossible: supply an entire city entirely by air. Known as the Berlin Airlift, it began cautiously, but soon expanded in scope and complexity. Cargo aircraft not designed for constant delivery became lifelines, carrying food, medicine, and above all, coal into the city. At its height, planes touched down on Berlin's runways roughly every 90 seconds, moving in round-the-clock rotations. Corridors had to be carefully managed, with control towers orchestrating flights so tightly that the city's skies looked like a conveyor belt of wings and engines. At peak operation, thousands of tons of supplies were flying in every day, each shipment calculated against the bare minimum required to keep the city alive. Over the next 11 months, the operation surpassed all expectations. More than 278,000 flights delivered critical goods into West Berlin. The cargo lists were staggering in their detail: flour, powdered milk, dried vegetables, oil, clothing, fuel, soap, and even building equipment. Coal made up the bulk. Without it, there would be no electricity, no trams, and no heating against the bitter German winter. Deliveries came relentlessly, pilots and mechanics maintaining a tempo more grueling than wartime patrols. At Tempelhof and Gatow airfields, ground crews turned incoming planes around within minutes. There was no margin for delay. Lives depended on precision measured in seconds. The dangers were constant. Fog, snow, and rain blanketed approaches, forcing landings in near-zero visibility. Engines failed in midair, aircraft broke down under strain, and some crews did not survive. Crashes on takeoff or descent were part of the terrible arithmetic of the mission, yet even these losses underscored its urgency. For West Berliners, the hum of engines overhead became as familiar as church bells. Each passing aircraft reminded them that the outside world still reached them, that their isolation remained defied. The city learned to measure time not by weeks or months, but by the rhythm of incoming cargo flights. One gesture during the crisis left a deeper imprint than any tonnage report. An American pilot, Gail Halvorsen, tied small candy bars to handkerchief parachutes and dropped them for children gathered near runways. His act quickly inspired others, soon expanding into organized candy drops, supported by donations from abroad. For children growing thin on rations, the sight of sweets floating down from a grey sky mattered well beyond their taste. It told them that this massive, impersonal operation also held individual care. Newspapers in the United States seized on the image. Candy bombers turned the airlift into an emblem of shared humanity. For Berlin itself, everyday life adjusted to dependence on the airlift. Rations distributed to households reflected the day's deliveries, bread or fats on 1 week's schedule, dairy the next. Coal was rationed according to precise measurements of incoming supply. Families reused odd scraps from packaging. Children sketched airplanes in school notebooks, evidence of how fully the airlift shaped identity. Far from breaking morale, the blockade fostered recognition that the West had chosen not to abandon the city's population. For Stalin, the blockade was intended as both punishment and leverage. He expected hardship to push Berliners toward dependence on Soviet resources or pressure the Allies into withdrawal. But as the months passed, the reverse proved true. Despite staggering costs, the Western Allies maintained the flights without pause, reinforcing their position with every successful landing. Observers abroad noticed not only determination, but symbolism. This was a conflict of systems played out in daylight, where delivery of bread and coal stood against coercion and control. Many feared at the time that the confrontation might escalate further. With nuclear weapons already a reality, some in both East and West viewed the standoff as a grave Cold War crisis. Yet it did not expand into open conflict. The clash remained economic, logistical, and political, waged with flight timetables instead of armies. That distinction came to define how the Cold War could be fought, not with battalions, but with endurance. By spring 1949, it was plain that the blockade had failed. West Berlin had endured, supplied entirely through the airlift. On May 12, the Soviets reopened railways and roads, allowing food and coal to roll in again. But the symbolism of aircraft descending in an endless chain had left its impression. The Western Allies had kept their ground, and Berliners who had braced for starvation had instead emerged bonded to their protectors. The political meaning outlasted the crisis. The airlift demonstrated that collaboration between Germans, Britons, Americans, and French could be real, practical, and sustaining. Crowds cheering pilots on tarmacs reflected more than gratitude. They symbolized a reversal of roles. The victors of 1945 and the people of a defeated Germany now stood linked against Moscow. From Stalin's perspective, what had begun as a bid to tighten control had instead propelled the Western zones closer together under shared commitment. Within months, the consequences spread outward. The very act of defending Berlin through bread and coal reinforced international partnerships that soon crystallized into lasting institutions. Rather than expelling the West from the city, the blockade bound it more securely than ever to their presence. And from that stance of endurance, the first permanent alliances against Soviet pressure began to take shape. From ruins to new alliances. By the end of the 1940s, the outlines of a new Europe were unmistakable. The physical destruction of the war was still visible in streets and neighborhoods, but the deeper change was political. Nations were being drawn into opposing systems that promised not unity, but division. For the first time in centuries, the continent was no longer shaped only by its own rivalries, but by two global powers standing on either side of an ideological fault line. The clearest marker of this new order came in April 1949 with the foundation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. For the nations of Western Europe, NATO was more than just another treaty. It was the assurance that if any member was attacked, all would respond. The United States, whose armies had once been expected to withdraw home after victory, now pledged itself to Europe's defense under the shield of its nuclear arsenal. The alliance transformed strategy. Deterrence no longer meant each nation standing alone, but a system where an assault on one meant confrontation with all. Nowhere was the shift more striking than in Germany. A country only recently bombed into submission was admitted into the Western defense system as a partner, its territory and eventual rearmament central to planning against Soviet pressure. The symbolism was profound. Within 5 years, the enemy that had fought Allied soldiers in Normandy and the Ardennes was recast as an ally integrated into a structure meant to check Moscow. For many Europeans, the logic was pragmatic. Containing Soviet expansion depended on Germany's strength. For Germans, it was the path to restored sovereignty after defeat and occupation. This emerging order unfolded against the background of remarkable economic recovery in the West. Industrial plants that had gone silent in 1945 began humming by the end of the decade. Railway lines twisted by bombing raids were relayed. Trains once again linked the Ruhr with ports along the North Sea. Housing programs rose out of rubble, building entire districts for families long trapped in cellars or temporary shelters. By 1950, West Germany's coal and steel output not only matched pre-war levels, but in many places exceeded them. Across Western Europe, industrial production climbed back near pre-war capacity between 1947 and 1951, a recovery faster than even the planners of the Marshall Plan had imagined. The political conditions for aid, especially trade liberalization and cross-border cooperation, accelerated that pace, tying national recoveries to a wider regional network. The recovery was not only industrial. Demographics reflected new confidence. Birth rates, which had collapsed toward the end of the war, steadily climbed. Schools and nurseries in the western zones filled so quickly that makeshift classrooms were assembled until more permanent buildings could be constructed. Agricultural yields increased with the use of fertilizers and machinery funded through aid shipments. For the first time in years, staples like bread and dairy were reliably available. Markets that had once displayed nothing but turnips or black market wares now offered varied produce, clothing, and household items. In the East, the trajectory looked different. Governments originally interested in joining the Marshall Plan were ordered to withdraw by Moscow, leaving recovery to central directives. Heavy industry and collective farming took priority, consuming resources that might otherwise have supported consumer life. Factories turned out steel and military goods, but basic foodstuffs and clothing remained scarce. For civilians, it meant ration books, queues, and limited choice in daily necessities. By the close of the decade, shoppers in Paris or Amsterdam found shelves filling, while families in Warsaw or Sofia still stood in long lines for bread, shoes, or fabric. The contrast between the two halves of Europe grew sharper each year. The West opened its markets, restored trade across borders, and reintegrated labor and industry. The East tightened its boundaries, cutting off imports and demanding conformity to Moscow's plans. These were not temporary policies. They crystallized into opposing systems, one defined by market recovery and rising living standards, the other by centralized control and shortages of consumer goods. By 1950, the division had become hardwired into politics, economies, and even the social expectations of populations on either side of the Iron Curtain. NATO's arrival added a political and military weight to this divide. For leaders in Western Europe, the alliance was reassurance that they would never stand alone against Soviet force. For Moscow, it was confirmation of encirclement. Propaganda intensified. In the East, NATO appeared in posters and speeches as proof of Western aggression. In the West, slogans emphasized solidarity and security, presenting the pact as a shield rather than a sword. Civilian life adjusted again to permanent tension. Drills, blackouts, and military exercises became ordinary even as no new war erupted. Amid these broader dynamics, everyday life carried signs of transition. Tram networks once more carried workers from modest new apartments to reopened factories. Electrical grids provided steady power after a decade of rolling shortages. Couples married and bought furniture that had been unavailable since the 1930s. Families displaced by the war finally left makeshift shelters for permanent housing. The psychological effect of these improvements was significant. Survival was no longer the only goal. People could imagine continuity, even progress, though always shadowed by uncertainty. Architecture reflected the divide. In the West, new towns and housing estates rose quickly, drawing on modern designs and mass production. In the East, monumental state projects appeared, designed to showcase socialist ideals rather than meet consumer demand. Buildings themselves carried political meaning. In one zone, private apartments with modest comforts. In the other, grand facades with hidden shortages behind them. Affluence and scarcity, pragmatism and ideology were etched into the very skylines. Germany symbolized the split most sharply. West Germany became the anchor of Western economic and military planning, harnessing its industrial base to fuel wider recovery. East Germany, under Soviet oversight, built its own apparatus with collectivized agriculture, nationalized factories, and strict political policing. Within a single divided territory, the systems of East and West stood face to face, embodying in miniature the directions of the whole continent. The global implications were already apparent. NATO framed Europe's West within the American nuclear umbrella, while Soviet-led organizations disciplined the East into conformity. Each side displayed strength through conferences, military parades, and ideological declarations. International institutions, such as the United Nations, grew less effective as decisions were vetoed across ideological lines. The Cold War was still young, but its structures of division were firmly in place. By 1950, Europe was outwardly transformed. Railways and highways crossed borders again. Families moved into new housing, schools overflowed with children, and factories produced at speeds not seen in years. Yet the renewal came within a divided framework. Reconstruction had not restored a single continent, but split it into two opposing halves moving in parallel. Western recovery, energized through markets and alliances. Eastern rebuilding forced through central plans and political loyalty. What had begun as survival now hardened into confrontation, with every gain mapped onto rival strategies. In less than 5 years, the massive logistical challenges of feeding, housing, and employing millions had been reshaped into something more enduring. Aid supplies, military guarantees, and industrial recovery had been converted into systems of political alignment that would define Europe's trajectory for decades. The continent was no longer measured only in rubble cleared or factories rebuilt, but in the alliances and boundaries that bounded its future. And while the scars of war faded in some places, the deeper cost of these years came into focus. Peace had arrived, but not the unity so many had hoped for. Europe's recovery carried lessons that echoed far beyond its ruined streets. Between 1945 and 1950, reconstruction and strategic competition turned the continent's ruins into the front lines of the Cold War, setting patterns that would endure for generations. 3 takeaways define those years. First, the human cost. More than 40 million people displaced, with families broken and children left to survive in rubble. Second, the operational scale of recovery. Cities cleared by hand, housing improvised, and economies restarted through sheer logistics. Third, the geopolitical split. NATO in the West, Soviet control in the East, an iron curtain dividing Europe in two. Which post-war survival story, the airlift, the expulsions, or the rubble clearance, surprised you most? Share your thoughts below.